It turns out that in the 16th century Australia was quite well known for being one whole together with Antarctica. The very part of this mainland was explored by Charles V. For a second, this is the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century. It also clearly states that there are 4 temperature zones in this part of our world. The first is cold, the second is hot, the third and fourth are moderate. But what is also interesting is the mention of the inhabitants of this part of the world. I mean, there were people living there. Agree, this is at least twice the opening time of Robert Scott and Admiral Byrd. But specially trained people do not mention this. Maybe they've just forgotten that part of the story. We now turn to the story of a journey to another world. Relatively recently, I came across a very interesting video story by Russian journalist and video blogger Andrei Tunayev, who a few years earlier, shared very interesting information about the journey of his acquaintance, who visited lands beyond the generally accepted borders of Australia and monkey people live in those lands. And here is what Andrei Tunayev says. Behind Australia there is still a land inhabited by real ape people. My friend has been there. Initially, I did not believe his story, but later I came across the story of a local Australian who reached the wall, from which the police brutally returned him home, and at that moment I realized that my narrator was not lying. My friend who visited there was so shocked by what he saw, that after the trip he shaved his head and retired to the ashram. My friend at one time was a wealthy man and loved to travel around the world. At some point he reached the maximum of ordinary travel, and began to look for extraordinary travel that could capture his imagination. And then he was offered a trip to the ends of the earth, which does not exist for an ordinary person. The journey itself from beginning to end lasted 21 days, where 20 days there and back was only the path to that mysterious land. During the journey itself, only certain beings could be taken with you and nothing else could be eaten. Where they sailed it was impossible to eat local food, it was impossible to accept treats or touch any fruits that grew there. The inhabitants of those lands do not understand our language, and they do not quite look like people, and any act on the part of a person can cause fatal consequences. The beginning of the journey began from the Australian coast, or rather the bay which is located behind all the famous fences, about which we are told that they protect from wild animals. After a 10-day voyage in an unknown direction, the shore of the mysterious mainland was reached, where on its shore the travelers met the owners of those lands. The very moment of the meeting was remembered by the fact that the owners of the lands met the guests as the lions glare at their prey antelope. The anthropoid apes held spears in their hands, and some of them had previous gifts from our world, which in turn confirmed the guesses about frequent visits to this mysterious continent. The arriving group followed to the habitat of the owners of the lands. After a short break, the process of presenting gifts from the guests to the owners of the territory began. The process of communication took place through a local Australian Aborigine, who knew the dialect of anthropoid apes. This amazing and seemingly unbelievable encounter with apes stunned a friend. The world, about which he practically knew a lot, that day became completely different and so incredible that the mind of a friend could not return to normal. After such a tour, my friend shaved his head and retired to the ashram. This story is quite peculiar and interesting as it gives references to some evidence that we can still observe on the eastern continents. I mean, if the story is real about the encounter with the great apes, then it explains a lot when we look at these historical bas-reliefs here, which you can see a lot in India, Indonesia and other nearby countries of the East. And this also possibly confirms the real existence of people along with anthropoid apes, which means that these are not the builder's fantasies, but a completely ordinary reality of those times. Do you understand? Australian Aborigines also tell legends that when their significant people died, their bodies were carried far south to the ice walls, to the native places of their distant ancestors. And we see that on the ancient maps indeed Australia is connected to the southernmost continent, which means that the passage can exist to this day.